Hello guys, and in this chapter we are going to cover Prisma relationship, or you could say the circular relationship between tables. So in this section we are going to cover the one-to-one relations and how are we going to do the relations. So as you see in my screen, you'll be able to see the Prisma documentation, and here they are talking about one-to-one relationship. So for this example, we instead of using profile, we'll be using address to showcase how to do relationship between models. Let's go to our schema. So in order for us to do the relationship between two tables, we have to have a relationship. In order to show you a relationship of one-to-one, we should make something that makes sense. So if we do it with our current book, it doesn't make sense because user can have many books and books can be so that would be a relationship between one to many, and that will be for the next video, not for this one. So if you will create a new model, and that model will be called address. So in the address we'll be adding an ID, and that will be the primary key, and as previously as the book and user, will do incrementation, so we don't have to add an ID for each address or any data on any row. Now what we will add as well is the country as a type of string. We'll be having city as the string, and we'll be having the street as the string. Now the next thing what we need to figure out is, so that's the address. Now we need to have a relationship between address and user. So what should we define as the relationship? I would regard this relationship as user can have one address, and address must have a user. So user can optionally have an address, but it doesn't have to have that address particularly. So we'll make that option for the user to have the address, so he doesn't have to have that table called address or any data regarding that. But whenever there's an address, we are for sure or accurate that there's always a user for that particular address. So that's the relationship. So one-to-one, but one side it's a must relationship and the other one is like an optional relationship. So we'll add the foreign key in our address. So this is the address, so we'll be adding our foreign key in our address. So what we'll do is add another attribute, special attribute. No, it's not that special. So we'll just add something called user ID. That is a type of integer. So that's the foreign key. Now, in order for us to specify or make a constraint that this is a relationship between address and user, we'll be adding another attribute called user itself, and that will be a type of user. Here we'll be specifying that this is a relationship between user and address. So how do we do that? Similar to what we have in here, the annotation. So we'll be using an extra decorator for us for metadata, in order for us giving the information to the Prisma that there is a relationship between the address and the user. And that annotation will be called @relation. Now we still have the problem, and that problem is regarding we have to reference it. Where is the foreign key in this current model? Who is the foreign key? And another thing is, which one is the key that we are referencing towards the other model, which is the user. So what we need to do is, in here relation will have special fields, and the first one would be what is our foreign key, and that foreign key will be this user ID. So we'll specify as fields colon bracket. Now the next thing we need to mention is we have to reference the ID of this particular user model in order for us to connect between those two different models. And that will be called references, and references we are specifying the ID, particularly the ID of that one. Now we haven't finished yet, and we only mentioned that the address must have a user. But we need to mention as well that user can have an address. So what we need to do is go towards the user, but it won't have the foreign key because we only, as database, we only need one place at least one place to have the foreign key. So we'll go to our user and we'll add the type of address. So that's the address model. Now that will be enough if we had a must relationship. Like a user must have an address can have a user. But as we mentioned, the address can be an optional for the particular user. And how do we do that is by similar in JavaScript or TypeScript per se. What you could do is add an extra question mark in before the column. So here we'll add a question mark before the address, and that will make it as an optional for the user. So let's cover what we have done here. So we have created a model, and that model will have an ID, country, city, street as the column. And we added a foreign key called user ID, but that user ID doesn't make sense if it's on its own. So what we made is another column, and that will be called user. And in that user, we specified the relationship between the user and address. So what we had to do is mention which was the foreign key, which is this line 26, and we mentioned the primary key of that of the other model, and that will be called ID. So that's the relationship between the user and those stuff. So and then in the other side, what we had to do is we had to mention the address column, and in the address column we could mention that it is an optional to make it seem like the user can have, but it doesn't have to have an address. So that will be one-to-one relationship in schema. Next thing we need to do is we'll test it out in our code. So in order for us to access the address, we have to do migration first to update in the database that this table exists. So what we'll do is we'll mention yarn prisma migrate dev name, and that will be address itself. Now it will create a new migration for our model, and it creates the address and adds the relationship between the address and the user itself. Now next thing is we will create an endpoint for the address in order for us to create an address. So we'll go to our users here. We won't create a new module, but we will append a new thing in our user. So we'll go to our user route first, and in the user route we will be adding a new function, and that will be called router.post, and in here we'll mention address, and we'll be adding a function called create address, and we'll be having another one, and that other one will be address as well, but that will be a get method, and that will be saying get address. Now next thing is we will go to our user controller. In our user controller we are adding several functions here, and those functions will be called export class export function export const create address, and we'll mention async request response, and in here we'll mention const address user create address, and in here as well we'll log out our address, and we will return our address. Now another function we need to make is the export const get address, and we will ask for request and response. In here we'll mention const address equals to await user service get address, and that will be a function in itself, and we will say return response address. Now we will add several functions in our services, so we'll go to our user service, So in our user service, we'll add two different functions, and that will be similar to our create user. So we'll say export const create address, and here we'll see address DTO, and in here we'll be mentioning the return Prisma, and then when you say dot, you will see address, and we'll use that address, and we'll mention address DTO. We need to specify the type, and let's for now let's just say type any. Now export, we'll mention export const get address, and we'll do that as well here. Return Prisma address, but instead of find one, we'll mention find many, and let's remove this part, and let's remove this part. So we have added the two functions, or the two things that we need. So let's update our user route again, and in here we will import our function. Here we'll mention create address and get address. Alright, so now we have our address. Now the next thing we need to do is run it. Alright, now in here we'll just go to our endpoint, and then we'll go users, and users, like let's just check out what kind of users we have, and we'll go to a new tab, and that will be called users and address. So at the moment we don't have anything, so we need to create an address for a particular user, and that particular user will be called John. So we'll go to our Thunder client here, and in our Thunder client, okay, I found it. Now in our Thunder client, I'll be creating a body. We'll go to our body. Actually, let's create a new endpoint. So we'll go new request, and we will say HTTP localhost 3000, and that will be users address, and we will be having a post method. We will go to our body, and in our user service we will actually schema in order to check what kind of data we want to insert, and that kind of data will be in here. We'll be mentioning the country itself. The country could be John country. Man, my creativity is dead. So now bear with me with my we'll call that John City. Alright, and the next thing we'll be adding as well is street, and in street we'll say John Street, and the last one we need to add would be the foreign key, and the foreign key would be user ID. So we'll say user ID, and we'll be adding here is the user ID of the first one, and that will be 1. Now let's hope it works fine. And no, it didn't work fine. So let's cancel it again. Let's make it count dev and see what the problem is. So if I send it, oh, okay, there was no problem. It didn't update my, something is wrong with my development running the test node dev. I didn't do it properly. I didn't configure it properly, but let's skip that for now. So we have sent it, and we received it in our logs. So we'll go to our endpoint here, and that will be users address, and we'll see that we have ID and user ID. So now we have done our job where we have shown the address, and we are able to create the user. But I don't think this is enough, where we are having only user ID particularly. But let's do something special or additional stuff in order to make it much more to make the JSON body much more plentiful. So what we will do is we will do will map the user ID to the particular user instead of user ID 1, because it doesn't make it doesn't seem so useful. So instead of user ID will be showing to the client, whoever is asking for the particular user instead. So we'll go to our documentation, and in our documentation there's something called relationship queries. So this part is where it describes about how are you going to map between relationships. So how would you showcase the user, in our the response, or user itself, how are we able to showcase the address. So in here it mentions is whatever you do in the function, what you will add is something called include, and that include you'll mention the relationship between them, and you just give a boolean of what you want to include here. So we'll do that, but instead of doing that in the address, because it doesn't make sense to have the address showcase the user, but we'll showcase as the user showcasing the address itself. So it will list out the address. So for at the moment, when we go to our users, it doesn't show that we have an address for that particular user. So we'll go to our new endpoint, not our old endpoint, that will be get users, and in our get users, we'll under users.service, so we'll go prisma.user.findMany. So how do we modify is, let's make it as an object here, curly braces, and now as the documentation mentioned, there is something called include. So we'll do include here as well. So we'll say include, and in the include we'll say colon, and in here what we are going to include. So when you say control space, you will see all available relationship, but for now we'll have only address. We don't have any other relationship between those tables, so we'll add address, and in here at the address we'll mention just true, and that's it. Now let me rerun it. Say on dev. Now what it will do is it will map towards any particular address if that particular user has that address. If it doesn't, it will just showcase address. Let's verify that. We'll just refresh our endpoint here, and yeah, we received one. So we received one for the first user, that will be John, and we received the address of that particular one. That's how we map it here. So we just mention include, and you'll be able to see the whole relationship between the user and address. And if the other ones don't have it, then it will be just specified as null. So let's add more special stuff. And that special stuff would be, how about so now we are mapping towards address to be instead showcasing nothing. We're showcasing the address itself. But how about when the user is being created, I want to create the address as well at the same time. So whenever we have data for that particular address during the create user, we want to add the address as well. But if we don't have the address, it doesn't matter, so there's no problem with that. So how do we do that? In the documentation of Prisma, you'll see something called nested writes. And nested writes is the thing that we were talking about, where you could, during creation of something else, you could create something else with a different relationship. So when you click in the nested writes, so this is the content here, we will go towards nested. So what it does is, as we know, for us to have to create, we have something called data, and the data earlier before we just mentioned the data with the user DTO. But now what we will be doing is again same thing. So what we need to do is, so there's nothing special here, but the special part would be this post. So in here in the documentation, what it's doing is there is a relationship between user and post. So during creating of the user, we are adding as well a list of posts, and within the post, so basically it will mention the posts object, and then in here it mentions something called create. So let's do that in our model, our user and address model, but instead of giving an array, because it's a one-to-one relationship, we'll do that as an object. And I think we could make it much more cleaner here. So we'll go to our user service and see how it's done before. So we have data, we have the column and user DTO, and I don't want to change anything here at the moment, and I don't want to give some logic here to check if, because what we want is, if there is no address, we skip that address object and we won't create it at that moment of time. But if there is an address in our request.body, we will add it in our we will create it with the user itself as well. So we'll go to the controller, and in the controller, what we will do first is we will deconstruct our request.body. So what we are going to deconstruct here is, first we will get our address. If the we will spread first the user DTO, but we will as well get the address itself. So the address is, if it exists, we will receive it here, the address as an object, but if it doesn't exist, it will be null. So that's the first step. We will deconstruct it, we will get the address object, and the rest will be as user DTO defined. Next thing, we will comment out our previous code, and we will just comment out, we won't remove it. And we will create another logic here. We'll just say, again, similar to what we have done before, create user, but we will do it a bit differently. So to map the same logic as what we have here, so we have the DTO here, the user DTO, but this one will be defined as address, and address will be having something called create. So in the address, we have to modify a bit, and we have to add something called an object, an attribute called create. So in here, we will spread as user DTO again. So we'll just give it back as user DTO. But what we are going to change is the address, and the address will be mentioning here as address. And what we will be doing is adding a property as mentioned as create. Now what we will do is, as the create, we will just add the data of the previous address. So whatever we have here will be defined as address. So that's it. So that will be it for nesting the address. So let's test out quickly. So what we'll mention is yondev. And I think, yeah, I need to save it. So let me restart again. All right. Now we will go to our Thunder client, and in our Thunder client we will be going with the post, but instead we will use address, city, street, building. No, not street, building. That was a previous project. Let me fix that. All right. So in here we'll be having where is our Prisma? So let me check our map here. So what we need here is, okay, so we'll need country, city, street, and we need as well country. And the country will be, just say John country. Do we need anything else? No, we don't need to even specify the ID of the particular user. So we'll mention 5, John 5, and that will be it. Let's try to send it now. And voila, it worked fine. And we created a user with that particular address. Okay. So we created the user with that particular address, and to see it here live, what we'll go is refresh it, and we have a new address, a new user with a new address. We could check out as well users.address, and we have a new array, a new object, and that will be the John with the user ID of 4. Now to verify that when we don't have user, if we don't have in our body an address, the Thunder client sometimes is a bit annoying. Either I have a problem with my screen where it's so difficult to scroll down. So now in the address, so what we'll do is let's skip this, let's remove this, and let's try to create a new object with John 6 as the fifth one, and let me remove the comment as well. And now let's try to send it, and it worked fine. So to verify, we'll go refresh here, and we have again a user without address. So I think, yeah, that's it. Today we have gone a lot. We have done a lot of things today. So let's recap here a bit. What we have done is a lot. Do I even remember what we did? All right. What we have done a user relationship with the address relationship, and what we have done is as a one, the user can have an optional relationship with the address, while on the other hand the address will have a must-have relationship with the user. So we'll be having our user ID here, and we'll add as well a decorator or a notation that we have the user ID as the foreign key and reference it as the ID for that particular user. That will be the primary key. So this will specify this user is unique, so this ID is the unique part of the database. Next thing we have done is we created an endpoint for the address, and that will be address post and address get. So we created a function called create address and get address in our user controller, and within our user controller we added those two functions here, create address and get address, and we did the same logic as previously in our user, creating user and getting user. The other thing what we have done is we have received the data and tested out in our Thunder client. After we have created our create address and get address, we have gone through the user.service, and in the users.service, in order for us to showcase a list of address with the user, so the user itself with the address, what we have done is a nested query where we included the address itself. So how we were doing it is by going to the find many function, and within it we add a property called include, and the include, it concludes all the relationship that we have within different tables. And in here we mentioned that we wanted to showcase the address, and we specified as the true. That would be for nested query. And the last thing we have done was we went to our create user, and in our create user what we were doing is we nested the address with the user if the address exists in the body. If it doesn't exist, it won't create a new address, but if it does, it will create a new data for the particular user that we are creating. And how we are doing is, as the document specified, we have to have a property called a create in our address object when we are creating within the Prisma. So the create will have the data of the address, and the data of the address is coming from the deconstructed request.body. So that will be it for in this section, and in the next section we'll talk about one-to-many, and I don't think we'll be doing this much as what we have done today. But yeah, hope you like it, and yeah, if you guys have any confusion regarding this part, just let me know in the comments below. And yeah, thank you very much and have a good day.